Okay, so to motivate what comes next, let's look at the correlator phi 4. Okay, so we're going to look at phi 4. Okay, and here I'm drawing the diagrams for the old normalization. So we would have this plus that plus that. Then we could have that plus, and I think you've drawn all of these already. Okay, so you have done this before, so no big shocks. And then plus something like this, plus that. And let me just think. Yep, I think that is everything that I wanted there. And then there will be other terms of order G squared. But to order G, here are all of the diagrams. Okay, now I want you to pause the video, and why don't you underline all of the diagrams that are vacuum diagrams? Okay, so pause the video now and do it. Okay, good. Did you underline the vacuum diagrams? Now let's check together. I'm going to underline them in red. Which ones are vacuum diagrams? Well, here's a vacuum diagram. There's a disconnected piece that's not connected to any of the external points. There's a vacuum diagram, and here's a vacuum diagram. And those are the only vacuum diagrams. So those three diagrams above are all vacuum diagrams. Because of that, if we were to calculate phi to the 4 with the new normalization, we would just have the following diagrams. So we'd have those first three diagrams as usual. Then we don't have to draw any of the vacuum diagrams. And then we would have these additional diagrams. Good. And just this. Good. So I hope that that's clear. That's just applying the rule that we just derived. Okay. Now, when we use Feynman rules, one classic problem that we're very interested in is some sort of a scattering problem. So we like to start in the past, maybe with a pair of particles, okay, in some accelerator or something like that. We'll shoot the two of them at each other. They'll get close enough to interact. All sorts of things will happen. And then eventually they will move away from each other and again stop interacting, okay? So this is at some point in the future. And remember, we always go into the distant past if the particles are well separated, or into the very far future so the particles are well separated. And in the middle, it's hard to say what we've got. We might not even have a two-particle state. We'll have some sort of a multi-particle interacting soup. But this is the idea of this scattering experiment. Now, there's two kinds of things that you could imagine happening. So one thing that you could imagine happening, it's absolutely possible that the two particles will just travel along and not interact, okay? So it's absolutely possible that there is no interaction. And there will be many terms like that where there's no interaction. The other possibility, which I'm drawing in green now, is when the two particles do scatter off of each other and they continue to infinity. And this, of course, is not the only thing that they could do. They might, scatter, then scatter a second time, then continue, or they might scatter total of 2 times and continue. All that kind of a thing now is situations where the particles do interact, okay? So let's say in this case, it is interacting. So we've got these two possibilities, one where there's no interaction and one where it's interacting, and both are allowed, okay? And if we just go back to the Feynman diagrams that we've drawn, each Feynman diagram we can classify as no interaction or interacting. So let's take our blue for no interaction. So the first diagram here on the 5-4 new, clearly there's no interaction between the two particles, okay? They just propagate along. Now, this diagram that I've just outlined in blue, again, the two particles don't interact. The top particle interacts with the vacuum, but they don't interact with each other. So that's also, there's no interaction. Here, there's no interaction. Here, there's no interaction. Here, there's no interaction. And the same for that diagram, and that diagram, okay? All of those correspond to no interaction. This diagram over here, the two particles definitely are interacting, and they could, for example, exchange momentum, which means they could exert a force on each other or anything like that. And if you look at the graphs, there is actually a difference between the different graphs, and this is how you're doing the classification. So in the case where there's no interaction, we have a graph that is disconnected. So there's a piece of the graph for the first particle, a piece of the graph for the second particle, and they don't meet. So in particular, there would be no way for these two particles to exchange momentum, and so they couldn't exert forces on each other. If they're interacting, then the graph is connected. So in fact, the difference between interacting or not interacting is also summarized by a property of the graph. It's whether the graph is disconnected or whether the graph is connected. And if we're trying to understand interactions between these particles, it is most interesting to study the connected graphs. Because of that, a natural question suggests itself. So we know that Z of J generates the Feynman diagrams. It generates all of the diagrams, okay? We know that Z hat of J generates everything except for vacuum diagrams. So Z hat of J doesn't include the vacuum diagrams. So now a natural question to ask, since interactions are associated with the connected diagrams, a natural question to ask, is there something that generates all connected diagrams? So this is a very natural question to ask because it's the connected diagrams that actually correspond to some sort of an interaction. And just so that you don't suffer any distress due to suspense, let me tell you there is an object that generates only the connected diagrams, and we're going to introduce it shortly.